In the Logan Paul v. CoffeeZilla defamation lawsuit, things are essentially frozen until the judge evaluates the efforts by the two sides to mediate the lawsuit. But just before the court paused the litigation, CoffeeZilla filed a very interesting motion that gives a little bit of a picture of what kinds of strategies the defense might try to take during trial, assuming it gets that far. This was the defendant's motion for leave to designate responsible third parties. And it's basically asking the court to allow CoffeeZilla to point to other people or entities in front of the jury and say, if Logan Paul was harmed, it wasn't by me, it was by these guys. And in the motion, he identifies basically two categories of third parties in this motion. One is essentially legacy media outlets reporting on CryptoZoo. The other is bad actors in the CryptoZoo team, namely Eddie Ibanez and Jake Greenbaum. And so in this video, we're going to go over why CoffeeZilla is asking for this, what his arguments are, and what might result from this. Let's get into it. Okay, so as usual, there is a link to a whole playlist of videos on this entire saga linked in the description below. So if you're new to the subject or you're new to this channel's coverage of the subject, be sure to check that out to understand better what's been going on in this case. Otherwise, let's dive in. So the basic gist of this motion is that CoffeeZilla is asking for permission to present to the jury that other third parties are actually at fault for Logan Paul's reputational harm. And if you remember, this of course is one of the main elements of defamation that Logan Paul needs to prove in order to win this case. Remember, he has to show that CoffeeZilla made a false statement of fact about him to at least one third party, that CoffeeZilla made the statement with actual malice, and he also has to show that this was the kind of statement that will lead to reputational harm, and that Logan Paul actually was reputationally harmed by this statement. And Paul has to prove every single element or else he loses. Now, in this case, Paul has also alleged that this is a case of defamation per se, which means that the statement made about him falls into a particular category where the law essentially assumes reputational harm would result. And because the statements at issue involve an accusation of scamming, fraud, deceit, what have you, that could be a basis for defamation per se. And so if it's determined that this case actually is properly categorized as defamation per se, he technically won't need to show that he suffered reputational harm because the law essentially assumes that that's the case. But in order to ask a jury to make CoffeeZilla give him money, there does have to be some kind of valuation that's determined for what CoffeeZilla would be responsible for. And so the basic gist of this motion is CoffeeZilla is essentially saying, I'm not actually the one responsible for your damaged reputation over CryptoZoo. And the idea is that that would potentially minimize the award that CoffeeZilla might need to pay to Logan Paul. Now, if you're a fan of CoffeeZilla, this explanation might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable because we're talking about a hypothetical outcome where CoffeeZilla is found liable for defamation and has to pay Logan Paul money for it. And I don't doubt that there would be some people asking, why would CoffeeZilla worry about this if he had a strong case? Well, I will tell you, this motion isn't an indication of how strong or weak CoffeeZilla's overall case is. This is just making sure that his team is litigating absolutely every aspect of this case as they should for his defense. I mean, remember how I said that Paul has to prove every element of defamation? Well, at the same time, CoffeeZilla is going to want to present the strongest evidence he can to prevent Paul from being able to do that on as many elements as possible. And that includes the damages element. So that's why he filed this motion. So this is basically just asking, if the jury were to find that CoffeeZilla actually defamed Logan Paul, how much would he need to pay? And in order to answer that, we need to ask how much of Logan Paul's reputational harm over CryptoZoo was actually caused by CoffeeZilla as opposed to someone else. And so CoffeeZilla identifies essentially two categories of third parties, like I mentioned before, that he says are actually responsible for Logan Paul's reputational harm. So let's get into more detail about these two categories after I thank this video sponsor.
This video is sponsored by CyberGhost VPN. CyberGhost VPN is a virtual private network service that aims to keep your online activity as private as possible. I've talked about this so many times before, but online privacy is very important to me, and especially living overseas, a VPN is a key tool for all of that. Because without a VPN, your internet provider, workplace, your school, home Wi-Fi, and even websites that you visit can still track absolutely everything you do online. And that's why VPNs like CyberGhost are most useful. CyberGhost encrypts your internet traffic and reroutes it through secure servers in 100 plus countries, ensuring complete privacy and security. That way, hackers, your internet service provider, and even CyberGhost itself can't see what you're doing online. That's because they have a strict no-log policy, and they say they absolutely do not share any information with third parties. And with over 38 million users worldwide, CyberGhost VPN is one of the most trusted VPN providers on the market. Out of the over 22,000 reviewers that rated the VPN service, 79% of them gave it a 5-star rating. So with CyberGhost VPN, you can access 40 plus streaming platforms, including Netflix and Amazon Prime and Disney Plus, and you can enjoy content from other countries in just a few clicks. And you can do this all on up to 7 devices with just one subscription, perfect for sharing with friends and family. And if you use the link in the description below, you can get an 84% discount with 4 months free. Plus, with a 45-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support, you can try it completely risk-free. So don't wait. Click on the link below to download CyberGhost VPN and start protecting your digital life today. And thanks again to CyberGhost VPN for sponsoring this video.
So let's talk about these third parties that CoffeeZilla wants to designate as responsible third parties for the alleged defamation. The first is the legacy media, or what CoffeeZilla calls the traditional media. There are a number of different names for this, but mainstream media is another one. CoffeeZilla starts out by talking about how he's an online journalist who investigates scams, fraudsters, and fake gurus that prey on desperate people with deceptive advertising. And he says he's received accolades for his work from traditional media outlets. On the other hand, he says Logan Paul is a YouTube celebrity and WWE wrestler who's had a bunch of very public missteps that have been well documented by the traditional media. And so CoffeeZilla goes into the highlights of media scrutiny that Paul has received over the years for his many controversies, to include prior crypto pump and dump schemes. And so this is laying the foundation for the idea that long before CoffeeZilla was ever over here talking about CryptoZoo, traditional media outlets like the New York Times and CNN, what have you, were already keenly interested in Logan Paul's hijinks over the years. And that leads into the more specific argument for why CoffeeZilla says that he's not really responsible for the broad impact on Paul's reputation over CryptoZoo. Essentially, CoffeeZilla says the legacy media, or the traditional media, didn't so much care what CoffeeZilla on his own had to say about CryptoZoo. And it wasn't until Paul publicly thanked CoffeeZilla for bringing the fraud to light that anyone in the legacy media took notice. But he says that once Paul came out with that public apology, almost immediately traditional news outlets started covering the CryptoZoo scandal, beginning with Paul's apology to Find Eisen, CoffeeZilla, and his seeming endorsement of CoffeeZilla's reporting on CryptoZoo. And then he goes on to show some screenshots of some of the articles that were written about CryptoZoo and its failures. And then he goes on. Later in June of 2023 and January 2024, Find Eisen continued to report on Paul, and specifically Paul's unfulfilled promise to refund CryptoZoo investors. But Find Eisen was not alone. Large media outlets also continued to cover the CryptoZoo story. And he basically says here that the traditional media outlets talking about the CryptoZoo scandal are way bigger than CoffeeZilla and have way more reach to the public than he does. And so he says, although Paul claims CoffeeZilla's statements in June 2023 and January 2024 caused injury to Paul's reputation, the jury should be able to attribute the portion of any alleged reputational harm that was caused by CoffeeZilla and that portion that was caused by the other larger media outlets also covering the CryptoZoo scandal. Basically, what he's saying is you have to take a step back and look at Logan Paul's reputation, not in the vacuum of this lawsuit, but in the natural environment where the general public was viewing the conversation about CryptoZoo and other people were talking about it. And doing that requires acknowledging that the CryptoZoo story became widely known in the US, not because of CoffeeZilla's 3-part series necessarily, but because Logan Paul got the attention of the traditional media when he put out his apology / thank you CoffeeZilla video. And ultimately, he says that's what lost Paul his reputation to the public. Again, okay, so that's the legacy media part. Then CoffeeZilla also wants to designate Eddie Ibanez and Jake Greenbaum as possible third parties. If you remember, these two guys worked on the CryptoZoo team. They were very internal and instrumental to the whole project, and they eventually just disappeared. And I get what CoffeeZilla is trying to do here. He's trying to close the loop between what Paul is arguing in the defamation case and what he's arguing in the class action case. Specifically, he says, in the class action lawsuit, Paul asserted cross claims against both Ibanez and Greenbaum for their alleged role in the CryptoZoo scam. Specifically, Paul alleged the success of the CryptoZoo project would define his reputation in the crypto space and more generally bear on his hard-earned reputation as a successful content creator and influencer. And he shows excerpts from Paul's cross-claim in the class action case where Paul alleges their misconduct caused him reputational harm. So essentially, CoffeeZilla is trying to use Logan Paul's own words against him. He's saying, look, Logan Paul over there says that those guys ruined his reputation, so we should be able to make that same argument over here. But the only problem is that the law that CoffeeZilla cites to here doesn't quite fit with Ibanez and Greenbaum as to a defamation claim, in my personal opinion. Specifically, it says, Chapter 33 permits defendants to designate a responsible third party by filing a motion for leave to designate that person as a responsible third party. A responsible third party is defined as any person who is alleged to have caused or contributed to causing in any way the harm for which recovery of damages is sought, whether by negligent act or omission, by any defective or unreasonably dangerous product, or other conduct or activity that violates an applicable legal standard, or by any combination of these. Now, if you read just that, it does look like Ibanez and Greenbaum should be designated so that they can take some responsibility here. And that's because it does seem, based on the allegations and information that has come up around this case and come up around this whole CryptoZoo story, it does seem like they were two very bad actors, and both of them took a lot of money from the whole project and from investors and just disappeared. But the problem is we're talking specifically about a defamation case, and it's a little bit more narrow than that. Specifically, it says, assigning proportionate responsibility under Chapter 33 of the Texas Civil Practices and Remedies Code is appropriate for claims of defamation where more than one person is responsible for harm resulting from the defamatory statement. So the key phrase here is resulting from the defamatory statement. So that means under Texas law, appropriate third parties for a defamation case are those that did something after CoffeeZilla's statements were already made, basically to make the impact of the statement worse. In other words, what we're really looking for is something that essentially amplifies the allegedly defamatory statements so that more people in the general public see or hear them. So taking that back to CoffeeZilla's arguments about the media, Eddie Ibanez, and Jake Greenbaum, not everything fits into that criteria, in my opinion. And I'm talking specifically about Ibanez and Greenbaum. See, there's nothing that I personally know of that Ibanez or Greenbaum did to make CoffeeZilla's statements quote unquote worse. For this, we'd be looking for some kind of public statements like that add fuel to the fire of the public conversation. But as far as I know, Ibanez and Greenbaum have completely disappeared since all of this started to come to light. In fact, they've disappeared to such an extent that the judge in the class action case entered a default as to both Ibanez and Greenbaum. This basically means that they lose the lawsuit because they never showed up to defend themselves in the first place. Now, did they engage in unlawful behavior that resulted in CryptoZoo's collapse as a project and the loss of funds by many, many, many investors? I don't know for a fact, but based on what has come out, it does sound like they probably did. But that's a different inquiry than this motion because all of that behavior was before CoffeeZilla's statements about Logan Paul being a scammer who scammed. So in my opinion, while I completely understand why CoffeeZilla would want to bring them into this lawsuit for the purpose of damages, I don't really think that we can say that they are responsible in any way for amplifying CoffeeZilla's statements. Now, that's a different story than the legacy media, however. Like I talked about before, CoffeeZilla lays out pretty well how the media plays a role in disseminating information about Logan Paul particularly, and how they have already done that for years and years and years before any of this happened. And he points to Logan Paul's apology / thank you CoffeeZilla video as the trigger for a bunch of media outlets to talk about what happened with CryptoZoo. That was a cat. And given the reach of the traditional media, their legacy media, whatever you want to call it, he basically says this story spread because they dug into it after Logan Paul apologized for it and made it seem like he actually agreed that he messed up. And so by the argument, that's basically the reason that Logan Paul's reputation was harmed by this whole CryptoZoo scam fiasco. So unlike in the situation with Ibanez and Greenbaum, the timing on this argument with the legacy media does check out. CoffeeZilla came out with a 3-part series, then Paul came out with his Thank You CoffeeZilla video, and then, according to CoffeeZilla in this motion, the legacy media took notice of Paul's apology and dug in, and then wrote for the masses about alleged CryptoZoo scam. Of course, Paul might come back in an opposition to this motion at some point and argue that there's actually a much closer link between CoffeeZilla's series and the media's attention on this issue. But even still, the criteria for third-party responsibility for damages does seem to qualify as to his argument about the media. So like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, currently as I'm filming this case is on pause until the court can analyze the mediation status between the two sides. In other words, how close are they to a potential settlement? But if this doesn't end up settling anytime soon, I imagine that Paul will probably file an opposition to this motion and eventually the judge will rule on this issue. And if CoffeeZilla is able to present this argument to a jury, I think the strategy could give him a decent shot at being able to reduce his potential exposure in terms of damages. And that's because, well, yes, he is a huge YouTuber. At the end of the day, being massive on YouTube doesn't necessarily mean you're legitimately a household name on a broad scale. And so there's a chance that a jury could look at this situation and say, you know, I don't think this video series and grouping of tweets really would have impacted Logan Paul had it not been for the legacy media's involvement in talking about it and amplifying this whole story about the CryptoZoo scam themselves. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Do you think CoffeeZilla might have a shot at bringing in Ibanez, Greenbaum, or the traditional media as third parties responsible for reputational harm? Or do you think this whole thing might get shot down? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you would hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more coverage of crazy cases and interesting legal topics, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is out there. And if you're really enjoying the content and you want to know how to best support the channel, consider becoming a member of Byte Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Links to both are in the description below. Otherwise, see you in the next one.